In this, the second of our devotionals on Isaiah in the Old Testament, we want to take a look at chapter 2, which was a vision that Isaiah had. Remember, vision was the first word, or is the first word in the book of Isaiah. And here he has a vision of the mountain of the Lord's temple, established above all the other mountains on the face of the earth. The text here in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 5 is identical to Micah 4, 1 through 3. And the text should be read both first in context with the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, but also we need to read it in the context of all of Scripture. And as Christians, we should probably be reading this side by side with Revelation chapters 21 and at chapter 22, verses 1 through 5. And so I would encourage you to use two Bibles, one for Isaiah, and then in the second one, place it next to Nuit. Open it to Revelation 21 and read that through 22, verse 5. And just keep that in mind as you listen to what we want to think about in terms of this vision that Isaiah had. The history of the mountain of the Lord's temple is, we really need to think about the mountain itself. In the ancient world, gods were believed to dwell on the tops of mountains. That is why in Genesis 11, as the people of the world moved eastward, they built a tower that would reach towards the heavens because they wanted to go up to the top and be like God. They wanted to stand on the very top of the world and be God, be a God. God punished them for seeking to be gods by scattering them over the face of the earth, over the whole of the world. Then in Genesis chapter 12, God promises Abram, his name would be changed to Abraham, that he would be the father of a nation that would be named Israel, that would be a blessing to all nations on earth. In Genesis 22, you'll remember, Abraham's faith and trust in God is tested. He is told to take his only son Isaac, whom he loved, to the region of Moriah and sacrifice him on a mountain that God would show him. You remember that story, that he took Isaac into the region of Moriah, and then he took him up a mountain, and he prepared to sacrifice him. And Isaac questioned him along the way. He said, "We have the wood, we have the fire, but we don't have the sacrifice." And his father told him, "Wait, God will show us. God will provide the sacrifice." And in fact, God did provide a sacrifice. In Abraham's case, the sacrifice was a goat that was stuck in a thicket. But in the long term, God provided a sacrifice for our sin in his only son, Jesus. 1,000 years after Abraham, David bought a threshing floor where he built an altar to offer a sacrifice to the Lord to stop a plague that was due to David's census for military conscription. After 70,000 people had died, God stopped the angel that brought the plague, echoes of the plagues in Egypt. David confessed and built an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 24, and you can read that story as well. David's son Solomon built a temple to the Lord on the site of the altar at the threshing floor purchased by David. And Solomon built the temple there, and people would stream to the temple. They would go up to the temple on the mountain. If you journey further back in history, in biblical history, Genesis 2 tells us that God planted a garden in the east in Eden, filled with trees, two of them in the middle of the garden, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A side note here, this was to be God's dwelling place in his creation. It would be, if you will, God's temple, where God would dwell in the midst of his people, in the midst of the peoples that he would create, beginning with Adam and Eve. He created Adam and Eve to guard and care for the garden, his place of dwelling here on earth. The text tells us in Genesis chapter 2, verse 10, that a river watering the garden flowed from Eden, then separated into 4 headwaters. Now, my question here, back to Isaiah. In what direction do rivers flow? We work here in Peru on a river. It starts in the south and it flows to the north. We live south of the equator. And it flows, this river, the Ucayali River, flows to the north, downstream. It goes from higher to lower altitudes. And so when we read here, in the last days, verse 2 of chapter 2 of Isaiah, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. They will stream upriver, if you will. They will go against what typically is the case of a current. They would go upriver. The phrase is the mountain of the Lord's temple, and all nations may stream to it, all peoples will go to it. In verses 2, chapters 3 and 4, many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples." These phrases, the mountain of the Lord's temple, and all nations and many peoples, versus the descendants of Jacob, it means people will come to the Lord's temple from all over the world, all different nations. And that's why we work with the ethnic groups, because the word ethnic comes from, in the Bible, ethne, or peoples, the nations of the world. So these first 5 verses are very, very interesting. A promise of what's coming in the future when these nations, these peoples, streaming up to the mountain of the Lord's temple to worship the Lord. It says, "Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord." All of us as believers are, in fact, descendants of Jacob. We have joined Israel to become the people of God. This is all in the New Testament theology, if you will. And then beginning in verse 6, it talks about the day of the Lord. It says, "In the day of the Lord," verses 11 and 17, "only the Lord will be exalted." People will come and worship from all different nations. They will abandon their gods, their gods that they worshipped in the different nations, and only the Lord will be exalted on that day. On the people of God, the descendants of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. Remember that story in Genesis chapter 32 and verse 28, when Jacob was fleeing from Laban, and he came and he went to sleep one night out with a stone for a pillow, and in the middle of the night he had a dream, and he saw the angels of God ascending and descending on a ladder from heaven to earth, and earth back up to heaven. Angel, of course, means messenger, and angels are God's messengers to bring God's word to God's people and to the peoples of the earth. So these people are, he says, "You've abandoned your people, the descendants of Jacob. They are full of superstitions from the east. They practice divination like the Philistines." And then it goes on to say they have these superstitions from the east, from the places like Babel and Assyria and Babylon, and more close to home, the immediate peoples, Ammonites and Moabites and the others that were east of the Jordan River. And it says they practice superstitions, they practice divination, sorcery and communication with the dead. They practiced pagan customs. They enjoyed financial wealth. The pursuit of financial wealth was their sole pursuit. They wanted military power. They exercised military power over peoples that they would conquer. And they practiced idolatry. All of this is here in these verses, in chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. And God says, the eyes of the arrogant will be humbled, and human pride brought low. The Lord alone, Yahweh alone, the God of Israel alone, will be exalted in that day. We will have to abandon all of the things that we worship and all the idolatry that we bow down to, the works of our hands, all will be brought low. And this is a passage for all peoples. It's for the people of God, and it's for the people of the nations, to stop trusting in the works of their hands, in the gods that they worship. And those can be spiritual idols, idolatries, or they can be things that are more important to us than God himself, the living God, the God of Israel. And so the question here becomes, what do we worship? What idols are in our lives? They may not be idols made by our hands, or they could be. They may not be idols made by our minds. They could be. But they are the things in which we trust, the things in which we put our hope. And this is a lesson for all peoples. In chapter 2, verse 11, it says, the eyes of the arrogant will be humbled, and human pride brought low. The Lord, Yahweh alone, will be exalted in that day. And in chapter 2, verse 17, it says, the arrogance of man will be brought low, and human pride humbled. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day, and all the idols will totally disappear. All the things that we put our human trust in from day by day, with the work of our hands, all of that is going to disappear. And it's God alone before whom we will stand, and we will worship him. So we need to stop trusting in mere humans who have but a breath in their nostrils, as it says in verse 22. Stop trusting in mere humans. They have but a breath in their nostrils. Why hold them in esteem? Why do we look to the proud and the arrogant and the powerful and the mighty and the presidents and the leaders of companies, the CEOs, chief executive officers? Why do we look to them and put our trust in them instead of putting our trust in God? Remember that we need to, when we read this text, we need to go back to Revelation chapters 21 and 22, because it says that God is doing a new thing, and that he will do a new thing. And he will bring the city of God, the holy city will come down from heaven, and we will worship God and God alone. So that's our thought for today, and our question for today, to read back through these verses in chapter 2 and ask ourselves, where do I find myself in these verses? And how do I turn and worship the Lord alone? Put my confidence and my trust in him rather than in the things that my hands have built, that my mind has pursued, that take the place of God in my life. I trust that that's something that we can think about, and you can take and go back through this chapter, read it, reread it, compare it to Revelation 21 and the beginning of chapter 22, and think about the history that lies behind this and the future that lies ahead of all of us. I hope you have a good day, and we'll talk to you again.